What's going on, guys? Kevin from Epic Gardening here. I've been getting a lot of questions lately about what type of hydroponic media to use in different types of systems. What should I use if I'm a beginner? What are the downsides and the benefits of different types of media? And I figured I'd just run through some of the stuff that I've grown with and what I think about it. And keep in mind, this is just my thoughts, but I've done the research, I've tested out a bunch of different products, and I've got my favorites and I've got things I don't like as much. So let's start running through it. The very first thing, one of the bigger ones that's out there right now is Coco Peat or coconut coir. Let me just zoom this in for you guys. What is it? It's basically ground up coconut husks. And in my opinion, it is a super important development in hydroponic growing media just because, think about it, you're in the jungle, you're farming coconuts, in a tropical region, and where are those husks going, really? They're going to be wasted a lot of the time. And if they can be ground up and treated in a organic manner and then shipped out to be used in gardens worldwide, that's obviously a better result than just kind of tossing them in a landfill or throwing them in the trash. So, what are the benefits though? Besides just that environmental impact, they've got some really cool benefits. So, number one, it's fairly inexpensive and it's actually compressible. So you can buy compressed coconut coir, throw some water on it, and it will absolutely blow up to these like impossible sizes. It's very, very surprising when you see a brick of coconut coir actually expand for the first time. One of the few downsides, though, is that it does hold a lot of water, and if you're not careful, you might actually drown your plants. But, in my experience, as long as you're doing it right, you should be pretty safe. And I got to be honest, this is one of my favorites. This is what I'm growing with most of the time right now. I even use coconut coir seed starter plugs. So I think you can see that I do like it a little bit. But let's go on. Next one is expanded clay pellets. A lot of you guys know this as Hydroton, except for, or unfortunately, Hydroton no longer exists. Now, that's not to say that expanded clay pellets don't exist, but the company that owned the mine that was pulling the clay out of the earth for Hydroton, that mine's actually run dry. So there is no more Hydroton as we know it, but there are a bunch of different products or stuff like hydrocorn that's more or less the same thing. Now, this has been one of the most popular media of all time in hydroponics. And part of the reason for that is that you can reuse it almost endlessly. It's got a nice air to water ratio. It retains water a decent amount. It's pH neutral, and it comes in a size that's actually pretty useful. So it's not, it's not as granular as something like coconut coir, but it is not as thick as something like a big thing of Rockwool, for example. So plants can work around it, plants can navigate through it without any type of problem. Now, a couple of the problems that I have noticed as far as downsides are concerned, it's pretty heavy. When you've got a full tray, if you're doing an ebb and flow system or something like that, it can get pretty dang heavy. I've found that it typically drains and dries pretty fast, so roots might dry out unless you're using a system like deep water culture or an ebb and flow that is protected from the sun in the sense that if you're ebbing and flowing during those ebb periods, you might actually the water might actually dry off of the hydroton and the roots might actually dry out and suffer some damage if you're not careful with how you position those plants. Uh, these days, it's a little bit harder to find, and it is strip mined. So if you're someone who's concerned about the environment, that is something to think about. But I like to think of the entire positive, negative cycle of things. If I'm going to be using it over and over and over and over and over again, taking good care of it, I don't really have a problem with the fact that it's strip mined because it's much better than something that's strip mined and then immediately thrown away. Sure to Grow. This is just a brand name of one of the typical sort of plastic-based growing media that's out there right now. A lot of people like it, but personally, it's not one of my favorites out there. We've got some reader feedback here. I thought this might be interesting to share with you guys. Reader says, just don't really like this. I feel like they reblended a plastic medium as some magic media. I would kind of agree with that. In the industry, we call this stuff sure not to grow. Pretty good there. I currently use it in ebb and flow, and my experience with it at first was generally negative. So what I've noticed, and I want to appear unbiased, so I have grown with it. I've grown a bunch of different things, most notably my microgreens that I grow. And I noticed that between a sure to grow pad, soil, and a coconut coir mix, the sure to grow pad grew the absolute worst, and it had a more likely chance of molding out, which you'd think, wow, plastic-based growing media is more likely to mold. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but I think it's just the way that it retains water in sort of a stagnant way that causes that mold to crop up more often. It's not reusable, so that's kind of what I'm talking about. Is you get something that's not only is it not sort of a very sustainable product in the sense that it's oil-based plastics, but it's also not reusable because the roots kind of intermesh between the growing media, and there's really not much you can do to use it a second time. So you pretty much have to throw it away. Not my favorite. Oasis cubes, they're similar to Rockwool. Um, it reminds me of those florists. If you go to a florist and you get get an arrangement to keep it healthy and to keep it surviving, they'll put it in that gray sort of foam stuff. That's more or less what Oasis cubes are like. Really good for starting seeds out. So germination and seedling phases, I really prefer Oasis cubes. A couple readers have said they love the new Oasis cubes. They've reformulated their blocks. It's an inert media like Rockwool, but a fraction of the price. And they seem to say that it grows equally as well as Rockwool. So Oasis is pretty nice. Again, it's not sustainable, not organic, so if that's something that you care about, that's definitely something to consider. All right, next one up is Perlite. All right, Perlite is something that's pretty well known in gardening in general, something that people use in traditional soil gardening quite a bit. There is no soil in Perlite, however. It's actually volcanic glass that's air puffed. So it creates almost like a pumice sort of situation, but it's actually much lighter than pumice. It's almost air-like. When you grab a handful of it, it feels like you're not holding much at all. And that is one of the benefits. It's very lightweight, and it does retain oxygen quite well. So you're not going to drown your roots out in Perlite. But it is almost so lightweight that it needs to be mixed in with another type of growing media to actually have a good result because it's that lightweight. It is strip mined, and it's small enough and there's enough airborne particles that you could suffer some sort of health effect by inhaling the particles. So, I don't typically grow with full perlite. I've tried it before, and like I said, it's a little bit too lightweight for me. I'd prefer to mix it with something so I don't like knock it and it just starts going everywhere. So that's kind of what I feel about perlite. Now, starter plugs. This is not necessarily a growing media as it is a growing option. You can start your stuff in soil. You can start it in, a bed of coconut coir if you want to go the hydroponic route. But if you want to do something really efficient, and that's what hydroponics is all about for me, is keeping it efficient, I like to use starter plugs. And essentially what that is it's a pre-molded material that helps you transplant easier. So as you can see in this picture, it's got that sort of squarish shape, and there's a bioresin that sort of holds all that material together. So when you pick it up, it's not like you're just picking up a little square of soil. It's going to stick together. And you can actually get it in quite a few different formats. You can do actual soil starter cubes. You can make your own if you want to, or you can do coconut coir cubes, which is what I personally prefer. One of the more popular ones is called the Rapid Rooter. It's a peat moss based kit. And on the sustainability side of things, a lot of people are sort of bashing the peat moss stuff because it's run out more or less in England and in other places in Europe. But that's not the only place on Earth. Apparently, Canada has reported that they have so much peat moss that they won't run out for another 1,000 years. So that's just something to think about when it comes to sustainability. And it's just such a time saver that I really prefer using these seed starters to start my gardens. All right, now we come to Rockwool. Rockwool is one of the more famous growing media that's out there these days. Very well known in the hydroponic growing community. And the way it's made essentially is they'll melt rock and then they sort of air spin it into these really long fibers, which is what they then compress into these cubes. So it's essentially rock in a thread-like format that's then smashed together. So, I'm not going to say that there aren't a lot of benefits to using rock wool. It's fairly inexpensive. It's somewhat easy to work with, but it's just not that easy to dispose of. It's like these thin fibers. It's basically taking something like rock, turning it into something that can never really be reused or disposed of or degrade, and then making a ton of that. So there's just all sorts of little weird issues. I'm personally not a fan of the fibers and the dust, so that's just something that I like to consider. And I actually wrote an entire post on this that got a little bit of attention from one of the bigger Rockwool companies out there. So if you're interested, you can check that out. Let's get on to Growstone. I was at a hydroponic expo and I came across Growstone and talked to one of their sales managers, and he gave me a bunch of the little samples. Oh man, I fell in love with this stuff. It's so cool. It basically is a hyper sustainable product, which is important to me. And the way that they make it, just check this out. Basically, they station their factories next to landfills, and they go and they get all of the glass bottles, glass material from the landfills. So basically, they're taking something that would have been stuck in the ground for thousands of years, pulling it out. They'll crush the glass into a powder. They melt that, and then they mix in calcium carbonate. And what calcium carbonate does under that amount of heat is it starts to bubble. And that's how they create this volcanic rock style effect that makes Growstone what it is. And the even cooler part is the heat that is put out by that whole process. They recapture some of that and they actually use it to run their facility. So it's a hyper sustainable product. And as a medium itself, I found it to be extremely, extremely effective. I've used it in ebb and flow and in deep water culture before. Now, the only downside is it's hard to clean because it's porous and sort of rough. So roots will kind of stick to it and they won't come off. So if you need to set up another grow with the same stuff, oftentimes it's best to just scrap it and move on. So on that angle, you may want to consider that it's not the most reusable thing out there, but it's so sustainable that I almost don't feel bad throwing it away. All right. I'm going to touch on these lightly because some of these I don't have as much experience with, but I do know that some people have used them. So rice hulls, personally, I can't imagine myself using it just because it's pretty small. I can't imagine it be that porous, and it would be an organic material that would sort of decay over time. So I would not really use that. Pumice is pretty close to perlite. You can actually use it in a similar manner, except for that it's heavier than perlite. Perlite's very, very, very lightweight. Pumice is only just a little bit lightweight. Retains oxygen well. Sand is something that people will use just because it's extremely cheap. You can just go to the beach, get some sand, and you're off to the races. It's not as good for certain systems as it might be for others. Like if you're putting it in a net pot, you're going to have to line the net pot or just not use sand because it's just going to kind of pour out. I think it may be good in maybe an ebb and flow sort of situation. But again, I might mix sand with something else and not use it solely as a growing media. Next, we have gravel. Gravel is a pretty good medium. It's pretty similar to like a hydroton or a Growstone situation, except for probably a little bit less porous. And probably the major benefit of it is that it's just really cheap and you can use it over and over and over again. Wood fiber is another one that's probably a little bit more on the fringe. It's pretty efficient. Again, it's biodegradable. It may not be sterile depending on where you get it. But if you want to do it on the cheap, if you're really into the organic thing, then go ahead and do it. Now, brick shards, I'm not going to touch on this too much. It's pretty much the same thing as gravel, but you do get the added element or hassle of having to deal with a brick dust, which is really not the most favorable thing on the planet. Polystyrene packing peanuts. I've seen people use these before. I personally don't. I'd rather not grow with polystyrene plastic. That's just not what I'm into personally. So I would pass on this. I just want to make sure that you guys know it is an option. Now we've got vermiculite, which is somewhat similar to perlite. It's a little bit different, and a lot of people actually mix vermiculite and perlite together and go ahead and use that as a growing media. But again, I would say use this like you would use perlite, and that you should probably mix it in with something else. Um, Maybe like vermiculite plus coconut coir if you're finding that you don't get enough drainage. All right, guys, that is it. That is the basics of hydroponic media. And I'll be doing some more extensive guides on the particular media, like what types of coconut coir, what types of Growstones you should use. But if you're more interested, this post that I pulled all this from, it's on the blog. It's at epicgardening.com/hydroponic-growing-media. So feel free to check that out if you want. And as always, hit me up, Twitter, Facebook, or the forums, or you can email me. This is Kevin from Epic Gardening. Keep gardening, players.